Anyway, welcome to Inside the Innovation Studio. Joining us today is my friend and partner, Gregg Schoenberg, a man of many hats and remarkable professional versatility. Currently, he is the co-host of Everlasting Business, the new podcast from Princeton Kaizen, which dropped yesterday. You can find it wherever you find podcast, Everlasting Business. And I'm going to ask him a little bit more about that in a bit, but I wanted to introduce him to the Innovation Studio largely because starting next month, Gregg and Ari will also be hosting a monthly office hours session where Academy members get to pose their biggest challenge. You can post your submission in the BizFixit channel in Mighty Networks or send it to bizfixit@princetonkaizen.com. That's BIZFIXIT at princetonkaizen.com. And we will put you in the lineup. And I think that's actually, in my opinion, could be one of the great new opportunities that we're going to be offering to people in the Academy, which is a opportunity to actually put your business operation under the microscope. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to properly introduce Gregg. I also wanted to introduce him for another reason. As we continue our themed exploration of Web3, that's something he knows a good deal about. And if I may, as sort of the opener of introducing Gregg, I would like to make the point that in our January summit, the question came up about which companies that we should be watching in the AI space, and Gregg's answer was?
I believe I said NVIDIA.
NVIDIA, wow! And there are now at this point, have they hit the $1 trillion club?
They're past the trillion.
They have passed the $1 trillion club. This is obviously an AI and software company. So let's unpack that. How are you aware? Why did you think NVIDIA was going to blow up as it did?
Well, first off, great to be here. Hello, everyone. Chris, thank you very much. Appreciate the kind and warm introduction. Yes, it's true. I'm a man of many hats and no hair. And that's one of my canned jokes that I say. And it is a way to underscore the fact that I always try to remain humble. I was a firm believer and I have continued to be a firm believer in NVIDIA as a company. I have gotten a lot of calls wrong. This one I got right. Essentially, ChatGPT was trained on a huge supercomputer owned by Microsoft that employed 10,000 NVIDIA chips. And so when I was thinking about how ChatGPT was sort of taking over at least popular culture when we had that summit, I thought back to how it used to be the case that technology first hits the enterprise, and once it scales in the enterprise, it then reaches the consumer, and how that model in the last decade or so has been turned on its head, where applications now first start with the consumer, and then they go to the enterprise. And so upon thinking about how 10,000 chips were needed to train GPT, and that people across the world were using it like crazy, and how enterprises and companies would soon get on board and say, gee, we need to do this and we need to incorporate ChatGPT into our enterprise. How do we do that? All of the answers kept on coming back to, well, you need a whole bunch of NVIDIA chips. And NVIDIA controls about 95% of the machine learning market for AI chips. And so it just became pretty clear to me, again, I get a lot wrong, but this one seemed pretty clear to me, that the stock price of NVIDIA was going to go a lot higher as more and more big orders would come through for their chips.
That's interesting because I think the AI, marketplace, everything changed in November when ChatGPT came out and generative AI was suddenly top of everybody's mind. And if you look at with just ChatGPT from Google or AOL or Facebook or any of the earlier companies, the period it took them to get to the real slingshot was a couple of years. And between GPT-3 and GPT-4, it was 5 months, and it was 10x better and the pace, the accelerated pace, like from January to the $1 trillion club is, the course where NVIDIA is going. Is NVIDIA now like in that Google position, or is that still like that? Are we going to see it? I think we got out of the 5 top, market cap companies. I think 4 of them are digital natives, or 3 at least. I think we got Amazon, Meta, Google. Is Meta still in there?
Yeah.
But that's the key question is like, are you going to see some really major new players in that sort of high altitude club?
I think over time you will. In the near term, you have to look at those organizations that control the data and think that they have an embedded advantage. I mean, when you think about Alphabet and all of the data that they preside over, whether it's Google or YouTube or any number of their other assets, you have to say to yourself, they have an advantage position today. But as we have seen since the beginning of time, it's very, very difficult to protect moats forever. There is a select number of companies that figure out how to do it, but most don't. And so I believe over time we will see, the operative word to describe the big technology companies in the last decade or so has been FANG, right? And the FANG will ultimately be replaced by a new FANG, and NVIDIA will be the N in that probably. But you can't see where it's coming, and you can't predict, how long it will take. But I do feel like history will, if not repeat itself, certainly rhyme again. And the biggest companies in the country and in the world in the future will not be the ones that have been in the recent past.
Wow. So Meta could become AOL in the new reality. Who knows? Let me go back and do a couple of deep bio cuts, and then I'd love to just jaw with you about Web3 and all that. But do want to properly introduce you to our audience. You had careers on both Capitol Hill and Wall Street before the age of 30. Is that correct?
Capitol Hill before the age of 30, and Wall Street while I was 30, and then beyond.
Right. So you were a legislative aide for Senator Bill Bradley, and then a corporate lobbyist, and then an investment banker. And that was for about a dozen years. What sort of unique perspective do you think that gives you for what you do now, which is a coach for CEOs and leaders?
I think the biggest thing is that I have come to appreciate from a lot of different vantage points that the world is unfair. And there is a great number of people who work in either government or in businesses, big and small, who believe that if the world could only be fair, they would be in a position to succeed and thrive. And what I guess I would say to everyone here is examine your own beliefs and question whether or not you are optimized for a world of fairness or a world of unfairness. And if you are optimized, if you will be at your best for a world of fairness, I would encourage you to change. Because I've seen from Wall Street, and I've seen from Washington, and I've seen from the various industries in between, that the world is incredibly unfair. And as much as I want to be hopeful, I don't see that changing anytime soon. And as long as you recognize that, you can do great things, but you've got to recognize that.
All right. Well, there you go.
Is that too bleak?
Let's see if we can maybe. Actually, my next question is about your stint as a crisis manager. So maybe it'll get even bleaker here for a little while. We gotta bring him down a little bit before we can lift him back up, right?
All right, we'll end on a positive note.
So again, you went from Wall Street then to a career, a stint as a crisis manager.
Yeah.
Which I find fascinating. What prompted that change? How did dealing with crises on a regular basis also inform your thinking on business, risk, leadership, entrepreneurship, any of that?
What prompted that change is that in the wake of 9/11, capital raising activity in this country dropped very, very dramatically, violently, 99% or more, or some crazy figure like that. And there wasn't a need for investment bankers to the same extent as there was beforehand. And so I found myself without a job and a very expensive apartment in the meatpacking district, not knowing how I was going to pay for that apartment. And fortunately, I got a call. It's probably at around 11:30 in the morning, and I was still sleeping, from a friend who said his wife worked at a crisis PR firm, and they needed somebody with some financial chops to help on the analysis and messaging around a number of new clients that had just come in the door. And he said to me, "Why don't you go talk to her and see if there might be a fit there?" And I realized I went to this big firm where nobody knew how to use the one Bloomberg that they had sitting in the office, and I did. And so for the next year and a half or whatever it was, I wound up being the financial guru for this firm. And as a result of that, they stuck me in front of a lot of their clients to help them walk through how they could best articulate the various forms of trouble that they were in and what they were doing to get out of that trouble.
Got it. So can you share any juicy stories from that experience? I would assume that you coming parachuting into a kind of a war zone, that's got to have some. You've got to have a couple tales in there.
Sure. I mean, I can't give any names, obviously, but what I would say is, you know that line from As Time Goes By in Casablanca, it's still the same old story, a fight for love and glory, case or do or die. It was basically all the stuff that you could imagine. It was greed, it was sex, it was ego run amok. And many of the clients that I worked with are names that I'm sure we all know on this call. I guess to sort of satisfy the real impetus of your question, Chris, I will tell you that one of our clients got into a lot of hot water because he had a wife and he had a mistress and he was cheating on his mistress. And while he could, out of his, vast bank account, manage the wife and the mistress to the mistress was taking things one step too far. And so he wound up doing a lot of questionable things to goose his own bonus so he could cover the new costs that he had found himself having to take on. And I don't think we were able to help him because it was pretty clear that he was guilty of all of the things that he was accused of. But we tried.
Fair enough. All right. On a more upbeat note, I also want to talk about the idea of a sabbatical because after all that experience, you actually took one, and that's something I think academics they take like every 7 years or something along those lines as a way to refresh their thinking. And you had a significant turning point at age 40 where you went decamped to Spain for a year. And kind of curious, was that sort of a conscious sabbatical for you? Was that like, I need to go and just kind of figure out what I want to do next? Or, what prompted that?
Well, so just a couple of points of clarification. I believe in the case of a sabbatical, it is a paid
good point.
Related thing, and I was not being paid. I yanked myself out of the career that I had on Wall Street because deep down I knew that I was not a Wall Street guy. I very much believed in my core that I was an entrepreneur, but I was playing the corporate game as some people do because the money's good, the stability is good, it is a respectable thing to do, and I wanted to be respectable for a long period of years. But after the financial crisis and the amount of money you could earn went down dramatically, again, money goes down dramatically, weird things happen, right, in Wall Street for me. I ultimately said to myself, it's one thing to show up in a midtown office every day and do stuff you don't want to do if you're earning a lot of money. But when you're not earning a lot of money, what the hell are you doing, Greg? So with the support of my wife, I pulled the plug on myself. We did go to Spain. Wasn't quite a year, although I like the sound of that. I think it has a better vibe to it, so we'll go with it. But it was shorter than a year, and I just wanted to cleanse my mental palate. And getting out of the country and eating pan con tomate, probably pronounced that wrong, and drinking Spanish coffee was a good way for me to kind of reset myself and think about what I wanted to do next. Because the reality is, Chris, I had no plan when I fired myself from Wall Street. And I knew that if I allowed myself to just kind of continue mailing it in, I would get more and more comfortable with my nice cushy life, and I wouldn't ever sort of find my true calling, which was as an entrepreneur. At least that's what I believed at the time.
Well, it's interesting. I think that gets to the concept of reinvention, and every time we sort of come to the end of one engagement, like this particular job has kind of come to an end. Maybe you've got something else lined up. Maybe you just kind of needed a break. You needed to step aside. And whenever you do something like that and you kind of get off of a particular treadmill, there's a process that you have to go through to kind of like figure out, like what are my core, values, and what do I want? What do I see for myself, in the next few years and maybe the rest of my life, if that's really, the time frame. I think everybody's got to ultimately put together a plan. And I certainly found that, and I think we both have found that. I think one of the reasons why I think you, Ari, and I have kind of karmically bonded a little bit is because we're all of a sort, publishers at heart. During your time away from the rat race, you discovered your love for writing and creating, and you built the Financial Revolutionist, which was a niche media company, or is a niche media company. You sold it, but you grew it to 130,000 subscribers. So what sort of revolution were you covering?
Well, let me just start by saying that I came across this great quote by FDR when he was trying to mobilize the country and garner support for the U.S. entering World War II. And in one of his famed radio addresses where he gave these speeches, he reminded the listeners that all Americans were the sons and daughters of revolutionists. And I love the sort of archaic use of the term revolutionist versus the more modern iteration of that term, revolutionaries. And I just like the revolutionist. It just sort of stuck with me somehow. And in the wake of the financial crisis, when I thought about how badly needed the financial industry was for a revolution, I thought to myself, you've got this fintech thing coming on strong. You've got a corrupt, old, steampunked system of how financial services operates in this country. And we need some barbarians. We need some, chapeau-wearing revolutionaries who meet at the coffee houses and plan the overthrow of the status quo. And so it was really an aspirational title in that I recognized that many of my core readers were family men and women who wore Dockers to work on Friday and who were not planning on overthrowing anything, but liked the spirit and the vibe associated with being a reader of an organization pushing the envelope in terms of thoughts and ideas about how the financial system could be reworked. And so I viewed it very much as an aspirational title that would tap into the inner rebel that many of us have deep down.
Right. And I think in addition to all the other hats you wear, you're also a markets guy. And I think you've kind of have a macro view of the world. And as we kind of enter this new, Web3 world, I think where you've got crypto still sort of vying for, I guess, relevance now that AI has kind of like become the dominant conversation starter. But are we in the middle of a revolution at this point right now? And should we be looking at ways in which we could make it more evolutionary, or should we just let it rip and see what happens?
In a highly regulated country like the United States, the reality is most trends are evolutionary, not revolutionary. We don't, have new systems of government that transform the way in which, our political system works overnight. We don't have new forms of money. The old money's out, new money's in, and the old money doesn't work anymore. It's evolutionary. We're too big of a country to easily, be overthrown or have any trends that overthrow us overnight. It is much more evolutionary. But the financial evolutionist didn't have the same ring to it. And it certainly wasn't as aspirational.
Right. Sure. What do you think is coming next? You obviously, I think, have a particular knowledge of crypto. As I understand it, there's probably potentially some regulation in the offing. But what's going to happen? I mean, I think from a regulation standpoint, obviously AI, there's going to be an atomic energy commission, that's global of some sort, right? It's something they've got to start to build some watchdog capabilities into AI. But what about crypto? What about in general? What do you see? You've got a particular government, banking, and kind of entrepreneurial outlook. What do you think the next few years look like for?
I think it's going to be
technology?
volatile. I think that as it relates to crypto, we are going to have a couple of very, very rough years. The haters have come out in full force since the FTX disaster. In AI, you have the exact opposite approach being taken that big tech undertook probably about a decade ago, where Mark Zuckerberg very smugly got up in front of Congress and made it very clear that they didn't know what they were talking about. 10 years later, you have folks like Sam Altman who recognize that Meta pursued policies that I would liken to the Mel Brooks movie, The Producers, right? Do everything wrong and somehow that will lead to a good outcome. Mark Zuckerberg did his best impersonation of, I believe, Zero Mostel, who was originally the lead character there. Sam Altman recognizes that to engage in a constructive, collaborative dialogue up front and try to help regulators understand where he sees, anyway, the biggest dangers is a much better way to potentially reinforce his moat. So I'm not saying it was done all for altruistic purposes, although maybe it is. But it will have it will land, and it has landed much better in DC than the approach that others have taken in the past. So I don't know where it's all going to go. Nobody does. I certainly hope that as it relates to crypto and as it relates to AI, we not just think in terms of a US-centric policy. We are in a great struggle with China, to just put it bluntly. The power competition between the US, the most powerful country in the world, and the emerging power in the world, China, is not going to be resolved anytime soon. And the US currently has a lot of advantages as it relates to innovation. But if we regulate innovation too much, it might appease some folks at home, but I think it will hurt us in that great power competition. And I would like to think that at the end of the day, those people who keep in mind that we live in a global world will win out, and we'll have sensible regulation that still gives American innovators and entrepreneurs, who, by the way, I'm incredibly honored to coach some of them and advise other, advise them in their businesses and the like. Hopefully, we will be in a position where at the end of the day, we will not lose our advantage in those critical areas.
Sure. I think I could talk to you all day about the Web3 landscape, but I think I want to certainly give you a chance to talk about what you do today. I think for the last couple of years, you've been sort of building your own coaching practice. And I believe Westcott, which is your company, is now, that is its main focus, is providing leadership advisory services effectively. In January, we worked together on a summit, and you presented something called the Leader's Parallax.
Yeah.
Could you explain what that is?
Yeah, in very simple terms, a parallax refers to the illusion that can occur when you change your perspective on looking at an object or looking at a concept. So the simplest example is when you're in your car and you look down at the speedometer and it looks like you're going 50 miles an hour, but the person sitting in the passenger seat looks at the speedometer and it looks like you're going 45 miles an hour. You can't be going both 45 and 50 miles an hour at the same time. The laws of quantum physics don't allow it. What explains the difference? Well, the difference is explained by your perspective. Even if you are sitting at a slightly different vantage point, your perspective can change dramatically. And over the long expanse of time and space, that slight change in perspective can matter a lot, right? If you think about a gigantic ocean liner, if it were to readjust its direction by even 1 degree, you don't really feel that in the first mile that you've traveled, but over the course of traveling in an ocean, you wind up in Morocco rather than Spain. So it's the same concept. And the reason why it applies so much to leaders is because leaders have blind spots. We all have them. I've got them. You've got them. We all have them. And while you can never permanently prevent against blind spots from emerging, what you can do is be mindful of them. And if you are mindful of them, and if you have declared war on your own blind spots, you can hopefully mitigate the extent to which you wind up sailing to the wrong country.
Well, I find that a super helpful kind of mnemonic, the parallax, because I had a example of that at one point where I was looking at it, from my particular lens, and the person, and we couldn't see eye to eye, and I was like trying to understand, and she was then sort of ascribing some attributes to me that I was like, well, that doesn't sort of compute entirely, and I realized, oh, well, there was some key element in our, initial, kind of agreement that was completely misunderstood by both sides, and sometimes that can be a very helpful, framework, because it stops you from going, no, you're wrong, no, you're wrong, because we're both right? We both have a particular perspective on these things. So I think it can be helpful to be able to look at those things from, just a slightly different perspective to get a good understanding of it. Does that, or is that a part of the podcast that this is now your chance to plug your new podcast? Is that a part of the podcast with Ari? Tell us about Everlasting Business.
So Everlasting Business was born of a lot of discussions that Ari and I have had about the keys to businesses that withstand the test of time, right? And Ari did a series a long time ago looking at some of the world's oldest businesses, whether it's a Japanese cement company or a monastery in Germany or any number of other companies that have serviced religious organizations over the centuries. And we began asking ourselves the question, why did these particular companies survive when 99.99999% of companies didn't? What unique attributes did they have? And can we codify those and elevate those insights in ways that can ultimately serve of use to people running businesses today? Because, as we all know, it is really, really tough building a business that lasts, right? And sure, it would be marvelous if some massive company comes along or private equity firm and says, we want to put a huge, price tag on your business and, give you the money free and clear, and you can go off and buy that dream home in Anguilla you've always wanted. That's a lovely outcome. A more realistic outcome for most successful businesses is to figure out how to make them sustainable for the long term. And while there is no, one right answer, there are some characteristics in common that these businesses have. And so we use the lens of history as a way to provide insights that hopefully entrepreneurs can use in the here and now.
Sounds good. Well, people can get Everlasting Business everywhere you can get your podcasts.
Everywhere and anywhere.
Spotify, Apple, the whole gamut.
The whole gamut.
I also would like to, give props for props are due. Gregg was also the person who helped give us our name, Princeton Kaizen. We were, after the January summit, Gregg and I were strategizing, hey, what do we do next? And I think one morning you just sort of went, well, what are we doing with Princeton Kaizen Corp? And I was like, And Ari was like, What was it about, the notion of Kaizen that seemed like that was...
Well, the idea of continual change, which the concept of Kaizen has evolved into, was one that I found very appealing, right? The war is never won, it's only waged. And if you want to continue to prosecute the war successfully, you can't rest on your laurels. So I very much like the idea of incorporating the concept of Kaizen. Japanese concepts in general are just really cool. And then I started thinking about the French word maison, right? Which I just tried saying with a French accent to, only lukewarm success. And maison means house. And even though Kaizen does not mean house, I thought to myself, just as words and terms evolve over time, so too has the word Kaizen. And maybe we can kind of morph it into the house of continual change. And we can start referring to the Kaizen as a house. Not necessarily a physical house, but a nexus of thought where people gather to talk about what's working and what's not working in their endless pursuit of change to make sure that they stay one step ahead of the most important trends that can affect their business. So the house of change is what I thought Princeton Kaizen could be a center for. And I like referring to it as the Kaizen. And over time, maybe it will ultimately make its way into the dictionary that, at least in English, it means house.
I like that. I actually think that I did not know that particular angle. I kind of like the house of change.
Yeah.
That's a good.
Thank you.
We got to work that into the marketing somehow.
Yeah. Well, you're hearing it live.
All right. Perfect. So last week, one of the other reasons I wanted to get you in here is because we had a senior executive producer for Real Vision, which is obviously big in the crypto space, and they raised a fairly significant sum of money to launch a Web3 platform, which is coming out, I think, August or September. I'm not sure exactly what a Web3 platform is, but it's got a lot of new gee-whiz pieces. I mean, they're basically not too dissimilar to what we do, which is talking head conversations and interviews and that sort of thing. So, but he said that we should tokenize and we should put our memberships into a token model. And Felix was like, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. So I'm coming to you to say, like, is that the part of blockchain technology that, regardless of what happens with crypto, is still going to become a part of the fabric of what we do? Or what are your thoughts on just like how should an entrepreneur and a small business owner be thinking about the crypto sphere?
I think a wise approach is for an entrepreneur to be abreast of the very powerful opportunities that over time Web3 will unlock. To me, when I think about a community, think about a club, the value of putting that club on the blockchain and having a token represent interests is you can begin to blur the line between customer slash fan and company. And if you give your customers slash fans the right to vote on the future of the company and the right to gain a share of the economic value that they help create, you fundamentally put the client and customer on the same side of the table as the owner, and you align incentives in a way that hasn't existed heretofore, where, let's say a club says, Greg, we want to sell you an ownership interest. It'll be $1,000 a year. I say, great. I tell all my friends about it. I pay the $1,000, and in the year, my $1,000 is gone. Maybe I've garnered 5 new members to the club, but I don't see any of those economics. I don't see any of the value in hard terms, right? I certainly have more people that I want to hang out at the club who I like because I recommended them, but I don't gain a share of the upside. On the other hand, if I were to be told by that very same club, rather than spending $1,000 to be a member for a year, you get to spend $5,000 but be a member for life. Oh, and by the way, as the club grows and gets bigger and you help in bringing new members in, you're going to get a share of the economics associated with that. I will gladly spend 5 times more because I know I'm not kissing that money goodbye. I know that it is an investment, and it is an investment that I am aligned with the person who is in charge of that club with. And so I love that idea. A question has come in. I'm not sure exactly how or where, but it has come in. What do I think about Taylor Swift and what is stopping her from tokenizing her fan club? I think the answer is, if I were one of the business advisors to Taylor, I would say, after you're done with this incredibly successful Eras tour, let's take a step back and think about how so many fans were screwed because of the fact that they didn't have a bot representing them when it came time to buying tickets on the secondary market. And let's figure out a way through a club model to essentially enable you to grow closer and more engaged with the people who took you to these great heights that you're in. And so I think at the right time, Taylor Swift should absolutely positively consider tokenizing her fan club.
So, okay, that's a good to know. What part of the cryptosphere do you think is at risk? What do you think is here to stay? What part of everything is still sort of figuring itself out? I mean, like I'm assuming if regulations come down in crypto, that could really that could be a hard.
Yeah, it's going to be tough going for at least until the election in 24, and then we'll see afterwards how the political winds are shifting. You may have seen that the mayor of Miami, Mayor Suarez, has thrown his hat into the Republican ring, and he is Mr. Bitcoin, right? He is trying to make Miami the Bitcoin capital of the world, and he's done a relatively good job of that. So you have competing voices and competing perspectives in this country, and I don't think we have enough of a plurality on either side of the political table to actually see any meaningful long-term legislation emerge in the near term. What I would say is, and I'm not necessarily saying that this is a good thing, but one of the more interesting and I think encouraging aspects to the current composition of the Supreme Court, which has all sorts of other aspects to it that I don't like, the Supreme Court seems poised over the course of the next year, if not earlier, to put a stake through the heart of something called Chevron deference. And it speaks to an important doctrine under which the executive branch of the government has grown in power over the last couple of decades. And to put it in a short and sweet format, we don't have legislation that covers quite a bit of our society and economy as it relates to things like environment, as it relates to things like communications policy, as it relates to things like financial policy. So agencies get to fill in the dots when there isn't clear legislation at play. What this particular Supreme Court is inclined to do is to say, if there isn't a very specific piece of law that says this is what companies are allowed to do, this is what entities are allowed to do, and this is what they're not, then the executive branch, through its agencies, is no longer allowed to just kind of fill in the blanks. The result of that is everything from crypto policy to many other aspects of our economy, artificial intelligence policy, is going to require legislation. And for better or worse, it is tough to get the plurality of Congress necessary to actually support sweeping new legislative frameworks for our economy. And so the result of that is, I think, specifically for the Web3 and crypto industry, there may be some tough times in the near term ahead, but longer term, unless you believe that the Supreme Court is going to all of a sudden have a change of heart, it's probably not going to be the case that the SEC will be able to outlaw crypto in this country, although it'll certainly make it harder for crypto organizations to operate in the short term.
Wow. So stay tuned. We have speaking to all that really great, kind of scoop from DC and from Wall Street. Here's a question somebody's asked: considering the diverse roles you've held, how do they inform your perspectives on business, entrepreneurship, and coaching?
Well, great question. I guess the first thing I would say is that there are a lot of books out there. There are a lot of bloggers out there, influencers who are trying to offer up meaningful advice on how entrepreneurs can thrive in the current business environment. And one of my favorites is I'm not going to name the particular publication, but here are the 10 things that Elon Musk, Bill Gates, and some other important executive read before 10 a.m. every day, or eat before 10 a.m. Every day. This kind of one-size-fits-all insight is more often than not more harmful than it is good. The reality is you don't take a diabetes drug if you have a bum knee. And every situation is different. Every entrepreneur has their own milkshake of strengths and weaknesses. And my coaching is very much predicated on the individual in question and trying to provide a customized approach that is suited for them. Now, can small groups benefit by a group coaching method? Absolutely, because they still have the opportunity to convey their unique challenges and talk about what their strengths and weaknesses are. But this concept of a one-size-fits-all approach doesn't work for a lot of coaching. I would say that, my co-host on Everlasting Business, Ari Meisel's stuff, is an exception because everybody needs help with enhancing their productivity and dealing with emails and things like that. So he is an exception to the rule. But there's a lot of dribble out there. And it's not that it isn't well intended, but you just can't apply one-size-fits-all methodologies for most people to really help them with their business challenges, in my opinion. And am I talking my own book? Absolutely, but I happen to believe it's true.
Well, here's somebody's brought up something on back to the reinvention idea here. Given your experience across various sectors, what advice do you have for somebody considering a career transition or starting their own venture?
Okay, great question. The first thing is, if you are currently in a job where you're getting paid and you have any measure of bandwidth, I would recommend that while you continue to do a good job or satisfy the needs of your current employment, you take a step back and say, okay, there is a difference between my job and my career. I am the CEO of my career, even if I'm a mid-level employee at such and such a job. And every day I'm going to get up, I'm going to think to myself, okay, Mr. CEO, what are you doing to advance your career goals? Your specific job may be an important component in satisfying your career. It earns you money, it gives you exposure, it gives you experience, that's all good. But you need to change your mind frame. You need to think of yourself as the boss and the person ultimately responsible for your career. That informs a lot of other decisions that you make. So, as it relates to thinking about a switch, what I would say is you're not making necessarily a career switch, you might be making a job switch. And you may say, you know what? Here's where we want to go over the course of the next 3, 4, 5, 6 months. But we don't necessarily have to quit on day one after that decision is made. We can still earn money while we can plan for the future. We can do things outside of our quote-unquote job to put us in a better position for when we make that ultimate switch. We can increase our network. I do a lot of work with clients around how to force multiply their network. We can do all sorts of things to build up your skills. Your job is perfectly well and good, but it's not the only thing that you need to do each and every week in order to support your career goals. And so if you start thinking that you are in fact the CEO already of your career, and that the job is just one of many plugins that you do to support that, it changes your vantage point and all sorts of new things can be unlocked as a result of that.
I think that's really super interesting. And one of the key questions I have is, and I've been through this and something that I also teach, but how do you change your mindset? You know, like you've been on the rat race for say 10 or 15 years. You went, I need to kind of step back, reload, went to Spain. But what is the process of sort of being able to reorient yourself? You know, is it picking up the growth mindset?
Here's what I would say. The base layer is that you need to change your diet. And I don't mean just your food diet. I mean your intellectual diet, your spiritual diet. The inputs that you take in affect you in all sorts of ways, many of which you realize, some of which you don't. So if you want to reinvent yourself, if you want to be a person who is a hard-charging killer in whatever industry that you're in, and you're still reading boring, cliched, dry business school texts from 20 years ago, you're not going to get there. You need to change your inputs, and you need to take what I would say is a rather violent, drastic approach to the inputs that you allow into your brain if you want to become somebody new. Because it's like saying you want to enter the Mr. USA contest, but you're eating junk food every day. Not going to happen. So you've got to change your nutrition. You've got to change, and by the way, you may want to change your nutrition as well. But you have to change all of the inputs into your brain, into your body, if you ultimately want to become somebody new in your career.
It's interesting because Ari was actually talking about. We did Inbox Zero in methods of invention.
That's awesome.
And that's also a process of just filtering out the inputs. Like, let me make sure, and it's kind of interesting. It is that process when you're, I think when we created the Princeton Kaizen Twitter account, for instance, you got to pick a whole new set of people that I'm going to follow.
Sure.
It's that process, right? Where you have to suddenly say like, and we've gone through this, everybody's done this, on any kind of program where you get to follow people, mostly Twitter or Instagram. But my daughter went through this period when she, in middle school where she like flushed literally everything from her, elementary school years that was, and started afresh.
Born again.
She was born again. She had to do it. And that's such a valuable hump to get over.
Well, let me just add something. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I want to just make sure I get this out there, Chris. So, very, very fortunate to have had a few very successful people as clients who think they have small egos, when in reality, many, many successful people, even if they don't want to admit it to themselves, have very big egos. If you want to reinvent yourself, one of the important things you may want to do is take a very, very long, hard look at whether or not you're full of yourself and whether or not you have a big ego lurking out there, projecting to the world, even if you don't think you do. And, a lot of my friends and colleagues on Wall Street have big egos. I certainly didn't have a small ego when I was on Wall Street and having some great years and the like. But when I left Wall Street, one of the first things that I did, in addition to taking a nice long trip to Spain, is I actually took an introduction to coding class. And I'll never forget this. I went to General Assembly in New York, and it said, in terms of like the description of the class, that this was an intro class. Got into the room, and it was very clear from the first session of that class that I was the dumbest guy in the room, right? Everybody else seemed to have, for whatever reason, even though they're all beginners like me, a more intuitive feel for how to code. And I took that class because even though I didn't know exactly which direction I wanted to go in with my career, I kind of felt like it would be important for me to have at least a basic understanding of what coders do and what software development is all about. And so I said, there's no better way to do that at the time anyway. You could do it now on YouTube, no problem. But at the time, go to a class. And after maybe one or two classes where the instructor was rolling, their eyes at me and everyone else was sort of annoyed with the dumb questions I was asking, I said to myself, you know what? I kind of think I don't give a shit. I kind of think it's okay that I'm the dumbest person in the room. And even though I was a successful guy for a bunch of years on Wall Street, now I'm nothing, but I'm doing it for a reason. And in the long run, I think this is going to help me. And I think I'm okay with it. And when I made that mental change, when I realized sort of officially that I was okay not being the big shot, really helped me. I think a lot of people want to change who they are, reinvent themselves and be somebody completely different. But in order to do that, you need to let go of all of that ego caught up in the current version of yourself. And that is scary for people, particularly as they get into middle age, because they want to project success, whether it's at the country club or whether it's around their friends, right? You go back to a reunion, right? You want to be one of the more successful people at the reunion, right? So there's a lot of emotional investment people have made into their own sense of self. And, I always like to say with my clients, we're going to slaughter some sacred cows together, and sometimes it'll hurt, but ultimately it'll be for your own benefit. If you can slaughter the sacred cow associated with your own ego and your own sense of accomplishment, you are way ahead of the game, and it doesn't matter how old you are. As long as you are still walking above ground, you've got time to do this.
Well, I think that's a good note to end on, because I think that this is what we're here for, is to kind of help all the leaders that we work with, kind of take whatever the next step they ought to be taking. And sometimes that does require that you take a good hard step back. I do want to remind everybody, Gregg and Ari will also be hosting a monthly office hours session for everybody in the academy. And currently it's Biz Fix It. I'm going to put that up for discussion on Mighty Networks of whether or not that's the go-to-market name or not. But that is the name at this point. It's exclusively for Academy members. Once a month, they'll take your questions live and help you resolve your biggest challenges. This is actually an opportunity where we're going to workshop different challenges that people are facing. So you can either post your submission on the Biz Fix It channel on Mighty Networks or email BizFixit, that's BIZFIXIT at PrincetonKaizen.com. And Gregg, thank you for joining us here. We'll see you next week on Inside the Innovation Studio.
Thanks for having me.